I'm delighted to present to you a wonderful speaker today. You have seen about him in the notice that he is a widely respected scholar, published by Oxford University Press and so many other publications. But at the same time, you also saw that he's a widely sought after speaker. Now, I have had the privilege of working with him. I have had the privilege of having the podium shared with him, having him as speaker at the Nanda Center at the University of Denver. But more than that, what I did was I asked several of his colleagues, and one of them told me that he is an institution builder. He is the one who brought to life the Middle East Center, and a center that's very active. Another one said that among brilliant people who are scholars and teachers at the University of Denver, and especially at Cornell, he's a star. Another one told me that he is a wonderful human being. And all that I can say, there's so much more to say about him. But I would say that these are the qualities that he embodies. And these are the qualities that you and I can see that he should become a good Rotarian. Friends, warmly welcome Professor Nader Hashemi, my good friend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ved, for that generous introduction. Thank you to Lauren, Peg, and everyone at the Rotary Club who's helped put together and organize this event. The Rotary Club's long-lasting commitment to humanitarian development, especially its long-standing commitment to combating infectious diseases, is a perfect setting to discuss the coronavirus pandemic and its effects on global affairs. What I'd like to do is pose the following question and then answer it. And the question is, are authoritarian governments better equipped than democracies to handle the challenges of a pandemic? Over the last 40 days, a global debate has emerged on this subject, and I want to address this topic both theoretically and practically, and with time left, maybe reference what's happening in the Middle East today that bears on this subject. But let me just begin with a comment on the scale of the crisis that currently confronts us. Roughly 3 months ago, no one had heard of the coronavirus disease or COVID-19. Now this virus has spread to almost every country in the world, crashing economies, breaking healthcare systems, filling hospitals, and emptying public spaces. It has separated people from their workplaces, their friends, and their family, and it has disrupted society in ways that we've never seen before. The coronavirus pandemic has changed our world, and arguably it will never be the same again. Over the last 40 days, over 250,000 people have been killed worldwide, over 73,000 here in the United States alone, and the number of known infections is now approaching 4 million. The UN Secretary General has stated this is the biggest challenge to global order since World War II. We are headed toward a 1930s style depression in terms of the global economy. Oxfam is predicting over 500 million people in the global south can be pushed into poverty. The International Rescue Committee, based on models from the UN and Imperial College London, has estimated that up to 3 million people in the global south across dozens of conflict zones could die over the next several months. Reflecting on this global crisis, the British philosopher John Gray has observed that from now on, the world will be different from how we imagined it. This is not a temporary rupture in an otherwise stable equilibrium. The crisis through which we are now living is truly a turning point in history. Now, this pandemic raises many important questions. How did we arrive at this crisis moment? Why was the world so colossally unprepared? Are some governments more responsible than others for the spread of this virus? To what extent are the criticisms of the World Health Organization legitimate? Has the peak era of globalization ended? And critically, how can we advance global cooperation in an era when countries are closing down and retrenching? I can't answer all of these questions, but I do want to focus on some of the political aspects of this question. Now, writing in the Guardian newspaper last month, the political theorist David Runciman observed that this crisis has revealed some other hard truths. National governments really do matter, and it really matters which one you happen to find yourself living under. Though the pandemic is a global phenomenon and is being experienced similarly in many different places, the impact of the disease is greatly shaped by decisions taken by individual governments. So recall my earlier question: are authoritarian regimes better equipped than democracies to handle the challenges of a pandemic? A global debate has emerged on this topic that goes something like this. As Washington, D.C. falters, Beijing is moving quickly and adeptly to take advantage of the opening created by U.S. mistakes, filling the vacuum to position itself as a global leader in the pandemic response. China is working to tout its own system. It has provided material assistance to other countries. It has even sought to organize how other governments around the world have responded to this crisis. Quote, "To me, what is so striking is the complete absence of the United States from public debates. The US is basically off the map, and China is very much on the map," noted the director of the Italian Institute for International Affairs and a former European Union policy advisor. "America has not just done badly, it has done exceptionally badly," said Dominique Moisy, a political scientist and senior advisor to the French government. He said, "America prepared for the wrong kind of war. It prepared for a new 9/11, but instead a virus came." And this raises the question, has the United States become the wrong kind of power with the wrong kind of priorities? Now, implied in this global outreach that China is pursuing during a time of pandemic is the alleged superiority of the Chinese governance model, particularly during times of crises and of pandemics. When the director of the World Health Organization declared in late January that we actually did have a global pandemic, he took pains to commend China for its response to this crisis. Quote, "In many ways, China actually is setting a new standard for outbreak response, and this is not an exaggeration." And he went on to praise China for, quote, "the speed with which it detected the outbreak and its commitment to transparency." Revealingly, the President of the United States has echoed this sentiment. Quote, he tweeted on January the 24th, "China has been working very hard to contain the coronavirus. The United States greatly appreciates their efforts and transparency. It will all work out well. In particular, on behalf of the American people, I want to thank President Xi." And a month later, Donald Trump echoed that sentiment. So this global narrative goes something like this. As the disease grew into a global health crisis, Chinese officials were able to quarantine entire cities in a matter of days. They suspended travel, they closed schools, businesses, they imposed strict restrictions on who could leave their homes. They built hospitals in a matter of 10 days, and they have been able to sort of lead the way in terms of contact tracing, a key element in stopping the spread of this virus. And the World Health Organization has continued to praise China's response. The executive director of the World Health Organization's Health Emergencies Program at a conference in Munich, Germany in February said the following about China. He said that the Chinese people feel that their government has stepped in aggressively and quickly to protect them. And this is the ultimate social contract between any government and its people. Now, contrast this picture that I've just painted with what's happening in many Western liberal democracies these days. A public health crisis in the West has forced governments to consider preventative measures such as requiring health checks, limiting movement, establishing quarantines that don't infringe on individual liberties and human rights. There's a deep legal tension between state-sponsored lockdowns and quarantines and constitutional law that uphold a set of basic principles such as freedom of assembly and association. Thus, some have argued that in moments of crisis such as this, liberal democracies are not as effective in responding quickly to these moments of crisis because liberal democracies allegedly are weak governments. They have to respect popular choice and legal procedure. And this narrative that is part of a global debate is suggesting that perhaps one of the big takeaways from this crisis is that authoritarian governments are better equipped than democracies to meet the challenge. And as you all know, over the last several years, we have seen a global decline in democracies. Democracies everywhere are under stress. If you look at the monitoring organizations that measure democratic gains and setbacks, the evidence is overwhelming that for the last 15 years, there has been a net loss for political rights and civil rights around the world. Contrast this with the image and the behavior of Russia and China on the global stage. They're very confident, they're very assertive, and they are seeking to expand their influence. Look at the data from this current crisis. The countries that have been most affected in terms of cases and deaths are overwhelmingly Western liberal democracies. The top 5 stand out: Italy, Spain, the UK, France, and the USA. By contrast, China's numbers are much lower. And of course, Donald Trump's colossal mismanagement of this crisis does not reflect positively on liberal democracies, and Boris Johnson's response in the UK is not much better. So the argument goes that perhaps China really has shown great global leadership, containing the virus, stopping its outbreak, sending medical aid and supplies and testing kits and surgical masks to other countries around the world. Is this one of the big takeaways and political lessons that we should be taking from this crisis? Now, one of the key intellectual defenders of this narrative is none other than Kishore Madhubani. He's frequently on CNN, he goes to Davos, he writes in all the major publications. And speaking about this topic, just a couple of weeks ago, he wrote the following in the Economist magazine, quote, this pandemic could mark the start of the Asian century. This crisis highlights the contrast between the competent responses of East Asian governments, China, South Korea, and Singapore, and the incompetent governments in the West, notably Italy, Spain, France, Britain, and America. The far lower death rate suffered in East Asian countries is a lesson for everyone to learn. They reflect not just medical capabilities, but also the quality of governance and the cultural confidence of these societies. After its initial missteps in Wuhan, China firmly deployed good science and robust public policy measures to break the back of the problem. It responsibly released the genetic data as soon as the Chinese scientists sequenced the genome, and it shared it with the world. And then Mahbubani ends with this remark: the net result, is that the post-COVID-19 world will be one in which other countries look to East Asia as a role model, not only for how to handle a pandemic, but how to govern more generally. Now, while Americans might scoff at this suggestion, Mahbubani claims that in the eyes of many people in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the broader developing world, China's global standing has actually gone up. And the rise of China as an alternative to the West has broad support in many non-Western countries. Now, let me clearly state my position on this argument. I strongly disagree with Kishore Madhubani. I think opponents of democracy and human rights would very much want us to buy into this argument. And while elements of what Mahbubani says might appear true and very appealing, I think on balance, his argument is deeply disingenuous it's politically motivated, and it's ethically flawed. Let me explain why. The concept of social trust is worth discussing very briefly. Good public health practice does not just require political control, it also requires transparency, truth-telling, and collaboration. Habits of mind that allow free societies to better respond to pandemics. Citizens of democratic nations can reasonably expect a much higher level of candor and accountability from their governments than in authoritarian regimes. And for this reason alone, democracies, at least in theory, generally have much higher levels of social trust. Democracies tend to have independent institutions that are free of government coercion, who during times of crisis can provide independent, informed explanations and information to citizens facing a pandemic. Just consider the efforts and the work of the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. Whatever Donald Trump and the White House might be saying during this moment, Americans can gain confidence that what the CDC has to be saying, or what medical experts such as Dr. Anthony Fauci or Dr. Deborah Birx might be saying, is actually honest and accurate information. And we trust the CDC and we trust these healthcare professionals because they're considered to be independent and they help advance social trust in society. In contrast, China actively hid the 2003 SARS outbreak from the international community. And I would argue that it is doing so once again in the context of our current pandemic. Local authorities in China deliberately suppressed early reports of the unknown virus, missing an early window that responders had to stop this infectious disease before it could spread. Although China did later help spread the details of the genetic sequence of this virus, the Communist Party in China underreported the number of cases, downplayed the risk of human-to-human transmission, detained doctors who tried to discuss this disease publicly. And this has had catastrophic effects for everyone on this planet. There are several studies now that suggest that had China acted earlier to contain this virus, not engaged in cover-up, then up to 95% of the cases that emerged in China could have been prevented from breaking out. Now, one of those heroic doctors in China who tried to sound the alarm was Dr. Lee Wen Liang. He tried to talk about it on social media. He was arrested, and he eventually died from the complications of COVID-19. And reportedly on his deathbed, he famously said, quote, "A healthy society should not only have one voice." There have been many other doctors and journalists and even senior members of the Chinese Communist Party who've been arrested because they've criticized Beijing's response to this pandemic. Human Rights Watch has issued a statement saying that we will never know the full details of what has happened because of the colossal cover-up by the Chinese Communist Party. And this is precisely the point. China's cover-up of the virus was not the result of a system malfunction or of personal error. In an authoritarian state, cover-ups happen by design. They are state-sanctioned and they are deliberate. The language of authoritarianism, the language of fear and force, is part of the DNA of authoritarian regimes. In the context of the global pandemic, what we are seeing today is the calamitous effects of the policies of authoritarian regimes. And to sharpen this point, let me just say something a bit more about social trust in pandemics. During a public health crisis, a government's credibility is a vital national asset. To slow the spread of the virus, a government must convincingly inform and instruct the public. And to do so, it must inspire trust. Trust that it is following the latest scientific data, acting out of the interests of the entire population, and enforcing measures that will help keep the public safe. Trust depends on transparency. Trust also depends on accountability. If governments appear to be concealing the truth or withholding information, their credibility can quickly crumble, and they will not be able to mobilize collective action to deal with this crisis. Now, one of the people who have intervened in this debate is none other than Francis Fukuyama. In a recent essay, he's argued that we have to discard simple dichotomies. We can't say that democracies are better than authoritarian regimes. In dealing with this crisis, there's going to be a range of democratic countries who perform well, some poorly, and vice versa with respect to authoritarian regimes. And he said what really matters at the end of the day is state capacity to respond, but also social trust. I think Fukuyama has it partially right. I want to sharpen my own argument by responding to him in the following ways. I think when this crisis is over, and when we have the opportunity to examine the behaviors of different countries around the world, I think democracies on the whole and on balance will come out looking much better than authoritarian regimes. Yes, there will always be the Singapores, the United Arab Emirates, and the Qatars, but I think these countries are generally non-representative of authoritarian political systems in the international community. They are the exception, not the rule. Most authoritarian regimes, I think, will not come out looking very good when this is all over. When it comes to social trust that Francis Fukuyama speaks about, generally speaking, it is scientifically provable that there are much higher levels of social trust in democracies than in authoritarian regimes. And this is due to the concept of political legitimacy. Political legitimacy fundamentally matters and is it exists in much greater extent and scope in democracies than in than in authoritarian regimes. Social contract theory is fundamentally based on the concept of political legitimacy, the consent of the governed. And there's many implications that flow from this. Social trust is deeply linked to social distancing. Observing quarantines is deeply connected to social trust. Why would citizens observe social distancing and other restrictions on their personal liberty unless there was social trust in government policy and in other citizens, that if we all respond in the same way, we can beat back this crisis? So this regime type, I think, profoundly does matter when we think about pandemics and political regimes. If you read Fukuyama's essay, I think one of the weaknesses of it is very US-centric and US-focused. He talks a lot about the problems in this country, the problems of Donald Trump. And he uses the United States, which I think we have to be honest now is a deeply flawed and declining democracy, to make broad generalizations about democracy on a global scale. I would push back and tell Professor Fukuyama, what about South Korea? What about Taiwan? What about Germany? What about New Zealand? What about Norway? What about Australia? What about the Czech Republic? What about Austria and Iceland? All are democracies, and on a global scale, they have been the best performing countries during this pandemic. Why not use these countries as a measure of democratic performance to assess the relationship between political regimes and pandemics? I think Fukuyama also ignores an important lesson of history. Roughly 100 years ago, the world was facing the 1918 Great Influenza. Sometimes it's known as the Spanish flu. One of the big lessons of this event, and let's be clear, this was a monumental event. At least 50 million people around the world were killed as a result of this influenza in 1918. In the United States, 675,000 Americans died. That's more than the number of Americans who were killed during World War I, World War II, the Korea War, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, and the Afghanistan War. So if you look at the lessons of history of this pandemic, you have to turn to John Barry's wonderful book, widely acclaimed book, where he discusses this particular question and the lessons that we could and should learn. And at the end of the book, John Barry makes the point that you have to tell the truth if you want to confront a pandemic. Truth is directly related to social and public trust. Quote, "The way you do that is to distort nothing, to put the best face on nothing, to try and manipulate no one." And if you read John Barry's book, he talks about the consequences, the loss of lives that took place because certain governments, both municipal, national, and state governments, lied during the 1918 pandemic, and it had drastic effects on the ability of people to survive the 1918 influenza. And so the big takeaway here that I think Professor Fukuyama ignores is that when it comes to pandemics and when it comes to telling the truth, democratic governments generally are better at it than authoritarian governments. And if democratic governments do lie, there are inbuilt ways of trying to keep them honest and to try to keep them truthful. Now, in thinking about this current moment of crisis, I was reminded of a very famous argument that the Indian scholar and public intellectual Amartya Sen advanced roughly 20 years ago. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1998 for his work on famines. And Amartya Sen famously wrote that no substantial famine has ever occurred in any independent country with a democratic form of government and a relatively free press. And what he does in his book is he compares China with India, the two most populous countries. And he notes that in the late 1950s, as a result of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, China had the largest recorded famine in history. Roughly 30 million people died from 1958 to 1961 in China. But India, by contrast, has not had a famine since 1947. And Amartya Sen argues this is because India has been a democracy, or at least it's been a democracy prior to the current prime minister in power. And that has made a huge difference. If you look at the arguments, you look at the capabilities, you look at the inbuilt procedures that exist in democracies, democracies, generally speaking, have these inbuilt safety valves where, when it comes to, for example, access to information. A free press can force governments to respond, can expose inefficiency, can make a big difference. I don't have time to go into the entire argument, but I think Amartya Sen's thesis on famines and democracy profoundly matters today for our discussion of pandemics and relationships to political regimes. And in fact, just last week, the human rights organization Reporters Without Borders issued a statement that said, quote, "If there had been a free press in China, if these whistleblowers hadn't been silenced, then this crisis could have been prevented and could have been prevented from turning into a pandemic." And at the end of the day, if you just think about, where this crisis originated, it originated in a deeply authoritarian state. And I think you can't ignore that aspect of this problem when we think about the relationship of political regimes to pandemics. And just take a look at this graph as I come to an end with my talk. If you look at the best performing countries, this was taken in the early days of the pandemic. The best performing countries in the world are South Korea, Iceland, Taiwan, and Germany. What do they have in common? They're all democracies. They have high quality universal health care for their citizens. They all had pre-existing strategies in place to deal with a pandemic rooted in preparedness, speed of response, central command, and rigorous contract tracing. They had competent leadership. Contrast Angela Merkel with Donald Trump. And interestingly, and this is something that we can perhaps talk about, most of these countries that have been successful in combating this pandemic, not all of them, but most of them have been led by women. I don't have time to look into the case of the Middle East. I think it's sufficient to say that the epicenter of the pandemic in the Middle East is in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I think if you look at what's happened in Iran since this outbreak of a pandemic, it's a textbook example of how the authoritarian nature of the regime is largely responsible for the coronavirus pandemic in this country. I'd be happy to go into details if someone asks me about this in the Q&A, in the question and answer session. So in conclusion, let me just return to the United States and offer the following set of comments. The United States accounts for 5% of the world population. But unfortunately, the United States is home to 1/3 of the global confirmed cases of coronavirus, and the United States is home to 1/4 of all of the global deaths. It was inevitable that this virus would come to this country and do harm to human beings and to our economy. But The scale of this crisis in the United States has been catastrophic. What we're currently experiencing is the moral and political equivalent of Pearl Harbor and 9/11 happening at the same time in this country. And it's important to remember that we are still in the beginning phases. This is just the second inning of a 9-inning ball game, to use a baseball metaphor. The worst is yet to come. There are predictions that by the end of August, we will have 134,000 dead Americans. And 2 years from now, when hopefully this is all over, there are predictions that we might have 500,000 dead Americans. So given what has happened now and what might happen to us as a country, this pandemic demands a national response. I don't have time to go into the details of how we should respond as a country. I simply want all of you to, I want to encourage all of you to read the lead essay in the current issue of The Atlantic by George Packer. It's called "We Are Living in a Failed State." The coronavirus didn't break America, it revealed what was already broken. And George Packer ends his essay by noting that the fight to overcome the pandemic must also be a fight to recover the health of our country, the health of our democracy, to build it anew, or else the hardship and grief that we are now enduring will never be redeemed. And then he went on to say that what we really need now is to ask big questions. People should really be thinking about transformational change. And I hope that one of the things that can come out of this disaster is this type of big thinking and transformational change. And if that does happen, the current suffering that we see right now will not be in vain. Thank you.
Fellow Rotarians, we're going to move into our question and answer, question and answer section of the presentation. Please keep in mind, the best way to do this is to go down to the bottom of your screen. Please go to the participants section and raise your hand under there, and then type your question, please, into the chat section. We don't have a lot of time today, so we're going to get to questions as quickly as we can. And the first question today is actually going to be asked verbally by Dr. Ved Nanda. Ved, are you still there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, please go ahead, Ved.
Thank you. Nader, it was very thought-provoking presentation, a lot to think about. You focused on nation state and its governance, and I think the insightful comments that you made, will be thinking about them. I want to go beyond what you said because you are an international studies scholar. What is post-pandemic going to look like in the world? As we look at that, is globalization dead? Is isolationism on the way? Is authoritarianism on the way? Cooperation that's needed in order to address all these challenges that the world community faces. Is that going to come back? I know you don't have a crystal ball, none of us has, but still, as you think about it, could you briefly share your thoughts with us? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ved. That's a very good question. I think what we're clearly seeing now is that states are leading the charge in responding to this pandemic. They're accumulating more power. They are making arguments that we are facing a national security, and so we have to limit civil liberties. So I think what we're seeing, one of the responses is, globally speaking, authoritarian regimes and authoritarian states are becoming more authoritarian. And this is something to be very concerned about. We're also seeing this trend where many states are invoking this crisis to expand surveillance of their population. This has huge concerns with respect to basic privacy issues. Right now, every country is retrenching, or we can't travel internationally. And the problem with this is that a pandemic demands global solutions and global cooperation. I think one of the challenges that we're facing internationally, and I'll say this very quickly, it's really the subject of a separate meeting, is how do we balance the following tensions with respect to China? On the one hand, we don't want to start a new Cold War with China. We need Chinese cooperation to deal with this crisis and future pandemics. But at the same time, China is deeply responsible for getting us into this mess. The way that it lied, the way that it arrested people, the way that it silenced journalists and doctors. There is a need for accountability. There is a need for taking China to task. So how do you balance those two moral imperatives? I don't have easy answers, but I think this is going to be one of the big debates in international relations going forward.
Just yes or no, Nader. Is the United Nations, World Health Organization, multilateral organizations, are they going to be stronger, weaker in the days to come? Yes or no? What?
I hope stronger, because we need those organizations to get through this crisis.
Thank you.
Nader, thank you so much for your response there. We only have time for a couple more quick questions. The next question comes from Rotarian Seth Patterson. He says, outside of the article, that we did post the article from the Atlantic, the link to that on the chat section. You can go to that if you'd like. But Seth also asks, my question would be, where can we find essays covering this topic, discussing it objectively?
You know, for all the criticism that people may have of the mainstream press, I think if you look at the debates in the Washington Post, in the Guardian, in the New York Times, in the Atlantic, there's a lot of good material there. So I would go to those places. I would suggest that you read everything critically. I would encourage you to stay away from some of the conspiracy theory that's floating around on social media. Turn to respected news sites that have a track record of at least sticking to the truth and trying to provide informed, objective interpretations and analysis of this country. So broadly speaking, those are the places that I would go.
Nader, thank you very much. Debbie, I'm going to try to sneak in just a couple more quick ones. This one comes from Raul Chavez, who writes, where does Germany's response to the pandemic fall within your analysis?
As you saw in the graph that I showed at the end, Germany is one of the better performing countries. I think it helps when you have a scientist as your head of state. It helps when you have a responsible leader. And what's so interesting about Germany is look at what's happening in the neighboring countries, in France, in Spain, in the UK. They are all the worst performing countries in many ways. But Germany, despite its huge size, has been able to do things that the United States, unfortunately, has been unable to do. To mobilize people, to get out way ahead, to have something that we still lack in this country. And I think this is the big scandal here, the absence of effective comprehensive testing, where we can figure out the scope of this problem, and then to engage in contact tracing. So I think Germany is actually one of the better performing countries, and it just affirms what many people I think should know, that Angela Merkel is really, in my view, the leader of the free world.
We are running out of time. Debbie, do you think we have time for one more, or should we close it out here?
One more, quick.
Okay, one more question. This question comes from Barbara Holm. Barbara writes, China has done an excellent job of fighting COVID-19 by using its authoritarian powers to track through cell phone data every person who has been close in distance to everyone within the infection. Police forcibly quarantine people and take their temperatures twice a day. Should the US use cell phone data to invade privacy in order to privately fight COVID-19?
Well, that's one of the big questions here. First of all, with respect to China, we always have to have, a question mark about what China says. It's a police state. We don't know the truth of what's happening there because of the nature of the regime. But with respect to cell phone technology, I think that is maybe one of the ways that we can help advance contact tracing. But I think it should be optional. I think you should have an option on your phone that if you want to sign off, you don't want to be part of that invasion of privacy, you should have that as an option. But this is one of the big questions moving forward, is how do we balance the need for contact tracing, the need for surveillance to deal with this crisis with people's individual liberties and their right to privacy.
Nader, thank you so very much for addressing the questions. Fellow Rotarians, I'm sorry we cannot get to all of them today. We're just out of time. Thank you so much for following the procedures and typing your questions in. Debbie, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. Obviously, a very generated a lot of thinking and questions, and I would encourage people to go out and read and get your hands on as much information as you can. Nader, I'd like to thank you today for your presentation to this group. Our Rotary Club will be making a donation to the Rotary International Polio Plus campaign, which will inoculate 33 children. With a 2-to-1 match that we have from Bill and Melinda Gates, in total, there will be 100 children inoculated against polio. So thank you.
Thank you.
Next week's program will again be online on Zoom. The fellowship will begin at 11:45 with the program to start at noon. The speaker will be Tay Anderson, who the topic will be Denver Public Schools. Tay Anderson is the secretary and board member of the Denver Public School Board of Education. So with that, let's recite the 4-way test. I'll speak and you'll follow along. Of all the things we think, say, or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial
to all concerned?
And with that and my Moscow Mule official, unofficial bell, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.